Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Charleston. My name is Jim O'Donnell. I'll be moderating this opening session. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Charleston, and I wish we were welcoming you to Charleston. For those of you who've been to the Charleston Conference before, over the 40 years of its existence, you should be imagining Gaillard Hall. You've all just been schmoozing and hugging and handshaking to welcome one another into the plush red seats as the buzz settles down. This is the point where I should be pointing to the skybox off here to my right, where our founder, Katina Strauch, would be taking a bow for her massive contributions to making this event possible over so many years and so successful for so many of those times. When the directors of the conference chose to invite my great friend Earl Lewis to set the keynote for us this morning, we thought it would be a good time to hear from someone with broad experience and broad perspective to help us think about the context in which librarians, professionals who are deeply committed to the dissemination of knowledge, free expression, and to building just, equitable, and inclusive communities, have to make our way in the world, in a world where we don't make the worlds. When you hear Earl's presentation this morning, I think you'll agree we made a good choice. His title will be Leading in an Age of Chaos and Change, Building a Community of Grace. And I think if you take that phrase, an age of chaos and change, I predict that many of you have been engaged in activities last night and this morning that give you a good sense of just what that means. So that does make this a good time to take a deep breath, look at a larger context, and take a longer view from someone with the perspective to offer that. Earl Lewis, my colleague and friend, is a distinguished American historian specializing in the social history of the American South. He's taught at Berkeley and Michigan. At Michigan, he became dean of the Rackham Graduate School in 1998. From there, he moved on to serve as provost of Emory University from 2004 to 2012. It was in those years that I met him when we both served on the board of directors of the American Council of Learned Societies. But from 2013 to 2018, he went on to serve as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, with the opportunities for supporting the humanities, culture, and the arts that great foundation possesses, and gaining the view of the world that you can only gain with that kind of angle of vision. He has now returned to the University of Michigan, where he serves as the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy. He serves also as the founding director of the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. It's a great pleasure to welcome him here. Earl, I wish we were shaking hands on the big stage under the bright lights right now, but we'll hold that for another time. Thank you for doing this. Welcome. I will come back to moderate questions and answers in a little while. Earl, take it away.
Jim, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak and participate in this conference, and thank you too for that lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone. I hope and I trust that you're all doing well, at least well enough. I'm honored to be speaking to you this morning and only wish the circumstances were different, that indeed I was with you in Charleston, South Carolina, and get a chance to sit and look at you in your faces. When we all retired to our home in late winter, I had no way to know how desirable routine human engagement would become. As a woman passed me the other day and enthusiastically said hello, paused and explained her yearning for unmediated human contact, I understood anew what has changed for all of us. That is why I elected to call today's talk, Leading in an Age of Chaos and Change, Building a Community of Grace. Without question, 2020 has earned its own chapter in the annals of American history. These last few days, with competing and confounding television and radio ads, have reminded us that from the outside looking in, American-style democracy can look demo-crazy. This perspective was driven home for me during a Zoom meeting recently. On that call, one person likened 2020 to the blending of the 1918 pandemic with 1968's season of social and political tumult and assassinations wrapped in 2008's economic collapse. In effect, we're talking about the conjoining of three pandemics: health, racial, and economic. As a colleague observed, one crisis would be enough. All three at once offers a kind of sensory overload. As I reflected on those comments, I found myself turning to, of all places, YouTube and moments of divine grace. While there are multiple candidates, two stood out for me. The first is from 1995, when the late, great mezzo-soprano Jessie Norman saluted Sidney Poitier with a rendition of Amazing Grace. The scene is the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C. The occasion is the Kennedy Center Honors for Lifetime Contributions to American Culture. That night, Norman's musical selection and tribute brought tears to the eyes of then President Bill Clinton, as well as Sidney Poitier. In many ways, Norman's rendition seemed to conjure up the inner man who had made his way from the Bahamas to screen and stage, in doing so defying probability and enthralling all with his own form of grace, craft, and skill. Fast forward from that celebratory scene of the night at the Kennedy Center to Charleston in the aftermath of horrific racial violence. 2 decades separate the two moments. In those 2 decades, Democrats and Republicans took turns occupying the White House. The Clinton presidency was followed by the Bush presidency, which gave way to the Obama presidency. Some had even begun to theorize we had entered a post-racial period following the election and re-election of Barack Obama as president. Yet the stain of bigotry and racism seems to have a permanent hold on the minds and souls of far more of our brothers and sisters than we often care to acknowledge. But the gruesomely calculated actions of Dylann Roof could not be explained away as an anomaly out of step with a post-racial world. From Emmett Till through George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, America's deadly dance with the demons of race, bigotry, and racism continued to erupt in churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques, as well as on street corners, in front yards, and bedrooms. Claiming he had been thinking about grace for more than a week after the massacre, President Obama, while eulogizing the slain, offered his own rendition of Amazing Grace. While perhaps not as on key as Norman's, its effects were nonetheless as palpable. Within seconds of his start, the congregants sprang to their feet and joined him in a collective moment of redemption and healing. Today, the death toll from the coronavirus tallies at more than 230,000 Americans, while at the same time, millions worry about their next meal, a roof over their heads, how to educate their children, mounting debts, few reserves, and a federal government seized by political gridlock. In the days and weeks ahead, no matter where you sit, what role you play, you will undoubtedly find yourself tapping into your reservoir of grace. Because the work ahead won't require only superior analytical skills or superb organizational abilities or keen communication tools. The work ahead will invariably demand of you building or shoring up a community of responsibility. It will require you to share ownership for forging change, that you evince a new commitment to patience, and that you show you care, really care, about the people around you, the world at large, and doing well as doing good. Let me expound on those elements in light of the worlds in which you sit. The economic fallout from COVID-19 has been brutal, and the costs continue to mount. By the end of the second quarter of 2020, colleges and universities were announcing deficits in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and schools and colleges in the tens of millions. State and municipal coffers are no longer sufficiently stocked. At the same time, demand for your services, according to published reports, skyrocketed. I hope that I am wrong, but there is every reason to believe this economic downturn will be with us for not a week or a month or a year more, but for 4 or 5 years. In light of this, how do you maintain grace if you have to combine furloughs and layoffs? Who do you select? What is essential work? The early weeks of the health pandemic revealed a secret we long taught ourselves to ignore. Some of the country's most fragile workers, meaning lower waged and often replaced, were also our most essential. They allowed grocery stores to remain open, buildings to be cleaned, packages to be delivered, and items to be serviced. As you contemplate right-sizing your organizations for the future, who stays? What's the demographic profile of your workforce? In setting your priorities for who stays and who leaves, can you avoid contributing to the lingering effects of racialized opportunity structures in the United States? Let me share an experience. When I served as provost at Emory University, leadership in the undergraduate admissions office repeatedly petitioned for funds to buy a new automated admissions system. For almost 5 years, I sent it back because there was no evidence they were committed to redesigning the underlying processes and systems. I worried that new equipment, minus a complete systems overhaul, would introduce new inefficiencies and drive up rather than down costs. Eventually, I got the assurances I sought and underwrote the purchase. At the end of the day, an analysis showed a need to eliminate about 10 positions. For years, we had a group of women tasked with ferrying hard copies of documents to individual units all across campus. Scanning and central record keeping negated that need now. When I looked at who would be affected, I discovered they were all Black women. These were women who worked because they needed to. And I had just authorized their termination. As a leader, I accepted responsibility, although I was livid that the admissions team couldn't have foreseen we had groomed them for obsolescence. In effect, we as leaders have failed them. In a grace-filled community, we begin with responsibility. A grace-filled community is not consumed with rank or status. It practices the principle of open communication and structured action. This means that hierarchies are flattened, all are invited to speak. But if action is to follow the conversations, they do so through the structures of the institution: committees, departments, faculty and staff senates, or its equivalent, administrative offices and officers, the board. In this community, no one dares say, "It is not my job, so I don't have to worry about it." Members of a grace-filled community own the process to the very end. In the case of the former workers at Emory, that meant offers of retraining where appropriate, decent severance packages in all instances, and even the words we are counseled to avoid: "I am sorry." Experience has taught me that sometimes you have to ignore the lawyers who are well-meaning and do what is humane. That means saying "I'm sorry" on occasion. That's required in a grace-filled community. As you have read, the burdens of our trifold pandemic have not been evenly distributed. The sociology of why is the subject of another talk. Today, I am drawn to the demands on your services. Close to 5 years ago, in a conversation with Tony Marks, head of the New York Public Library, I was reminded of the unevenness of basic resources in this land of plenty. Tony commented on asking a couple of young people sprayed out on the steps of a community library in the city what they were up to. To his surprise, the collection told him they needed internet connection, and the weak Wi-Fi signal emanating from the public library was their best hope of getting the service needed to complete homework assignments so they could compete in a world that measured generations in 18 months rather than the 25 years their grandparents had been taught. And it is not just public libraries that are called on to provide such services. My assistant, who lives in Detroit, lives in an area with limited in-home Wi-Fi coverage. While we took steps to underwrite the purchase of expanded data coverage so he can create needed hotspots, in the past, he tapped a nearby community college library for Wi-Fi and other services. Denied access to the building because of COVID, he was told he needed to fill out a newly required attestation form that assured others he was healthy and exhibited no signs of the virus before he could be admitted. His first reaction was why. His second was okay. His third was it's too much of a hassle, and he left. With COVID, for all the proper reasons, access to the facilities and the services that you provide have been limited. With a looming national uptick in infections, even recent easing of access may be reversed. Yet, as you well know, your services may be in even greater demand as students study from home, adults work from home, and workplaces across all sectors ask whether work from anywhere is a crisis-induced necessity or a permanent way of organizing work and labor. A grace-filled community is planning now for that eventuality. It asks, if McKinsey and others are correct about the changing nature of work, which may entail the loss of as many as 39 to 54 million jobs in the United States by 2030, what's our role in reminding folks of the dignity of labor in an automated world? If you're a publisher, your answer to that question may differ from that of a librarian. Regardless, all of you will need new approaches, new partners, and a new tolerance for experimentation. Understanding this point is why one of my all-time favorite grants made during my time as president of the Mellon Foundation went to Bard College. Leon Botstein, Bard's president, and colleagues had the beautiful audacity to imagine they could bring a 2-year Bard degree to community members in Brooklyn, teaming Bard with the Brooklyn Public Library to make it possible for folks to advance themselves educationally. Why is this important? Research has repeatedly shown that some college, and particularly a degree in the aggregate, makes you more robot ready and robot proof than a high school degree alone. Thus, as leaders, your job must include future forecasting. You should be asking, how do I contribute to the common good, not just in the near term? How do I help shape the world I can imagine? That must be on the table. And what's the takeaway? A grace-filled community demands multiple architects. Each member of a grace-filled community enters fully cognizant of what they have achieved and what they are still to learn. They enter with confidence, but not arrogance. They enter expecting as much of themselves as they expect of others. For them, there is no sense of entitlement, for they know what they did yesterday in no way guarantees what they will accomplish in the future. A grace-filled community, after all, seeks institution builders. These institution builders understand that a field community does not begin or end at a campus's edge. They seek out those neighborhoods rich with aspirations, but not material possessions. Where others see the dispossessed, they see young and old who dream of a world never seen, but one that's sensed, who dream of a world where hard work and perseverance inoculate you from life's miserable underbelly of poverty, crime, incarceration, drugs, and death. These builders understand that becoming a prisoner need not mean the end of one's humanity. A grace-filled community requires a staff that understands the difference between a job, a career, and a calling. If getting out of bed 5 days a week, 48 to 50 weeks per year only translates into a job, you're failing yourself and those around you. Nor is it simply a career that offers unbounded opportunities for advancement that should be your sole motivator. Members of a grace-filled community understand that they too are institution builders and that the smallest gesture, when no one is looking, is what's expected of them. So if they may see a piece of paper on the ground, they don't walk by it, they pick it up, even though someone may say that's not their job. They pick it up, they toss it into the receptacle, hoping all along that others will take heed and do the same. Members of this grace-filled community are also willing, as I hope and have suggested, to experiment. Early on in my time as president of Mellon, the head of one of the nation's leading public university academic presses took me aside and shared a worry about the future of academic publishing. He lamented that more than half of the academic presses could disappear by the third decade of the 21st century. He says, especially so if there was not thoughtful intervention. While a dean at the University of Michigan in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that press, the University of Michigan's press, reported to me. When I became provost at Emory, I discovered we had no press. This set me on the realization that about 120 entities around the country support the academic publishing enterprise, and that more than 5,000 institutions get by without contributing financially. I recall going back to my New York City offices and ruminating over the implications of a 50% attrition rate. I called Don Waters, who was then the head of the scholarly communications portfolio at the Mellon Foundation, and asked him if he shared this assessment I had heard. He shared his fears. I then went to the Mellon board to express worries that the disappearance of 25 to 50% of the presses portended horrendous consequences for the academy, especially the humanities and parts of the social sciences. My board colleagues, to my surprise, didn't share my worries. They figured smart people, if presented with a crisis, will rally and come up with workable solutions. JSTOR, a Mellon funded and sparked initiative, stood as a ready example. While the worry about the disappearance of the presses and the JSTOR examples may have been influenced by what the late Bill Bowen labeled the free rider effect, I wasn't as sanguine as my colleagues about the prospects for a tidy and timely solution. I feared, and still do, that our failure to address this real problem may consume a generation of young scholars whose only fault was being born in time for calamitous change. And even an attempted partnership with the AAU and the ARL failed to produce a workable solution or two. So I ask, what kinds of experiments should be tried now before a full crisis requires something more of us? How do we begin and think about thoughtful experimentation? Is this the moment to question the federalization of the book as the end all and be all for tenure in certain fields? If it is, who can and should champion the change? Is this the moment to create a kind of academic commons, which requires colleges and universities to contribute, if they lack a press, to help defray some of the costs of publishing? Can we devise a distribution system that aids the less well-heeled presses without further subsidizing the more financially secure imprints? Is this a time when presses should retain more of their positive margins rather than having them absorbed by the larger institutions? Who, I ask, is cataloging and analyzing successful approaches or suggesting new models? Basically, who is willing to outline the roster of experiments needed to sustain a grace-filled community? Members of a grace-filled community must exhibit the patience to embrace each encounter as another teaching moment. As you reflect on my words, I ask that you return to the moment for a moment to Charleston in 2015, or Pittsburgh in 2018, or, and you name the place. In the world of libraries, book publishing, and knowledge production, what's your role in helping to build and sustain a more just, equitable world? The New York Times featured an article last week entitled, "There are tons of brown faces missing. Publishers step up diversity efforts." Maybe I'm getting old. I turn 65 next week and perhaps a little cranky. But I have seen folks of color go in and out of favor over the last 50 years, like last season's sitcoms. Diversity without a carefully crafted plan for equity and inclusion may appease the accountants in all of us who want to measure progress. But in the end, the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor will compete with the deaths of Emmett Till and Tamir Rice, becoming yet one more example of what my friend Carol Anderson labeled white rage. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to do so much more. And so I turn to you. Why not begin with an internal examination of the organizations you head or lead, the institutions you are a part of? What if every publishing house, every library, every major institution in the United States committed to a 3-year internal reparations examination? What could be the result? Deep, painful, but perhaps exhilarating learning? Cathartic change? Something beyond a DEI framework? Who knows? The work won't be easy. But if you believe in a grace-filled community, the work is necessary. After all, a grace-filled community is peopled by those who care about others as much as they care about themselves. That caring asks that we acknowledge our vulnerabilities and insecurities. The loftier things I have hinted at will prove impossible to attain without careful attention to the small matters. In the days and weeks ahead, the word fatigue will increase in saliency and frequency. More and more of us have grown tired of staying at home, separated from the world we knew and often favored. One person I know, when quizzed about the isolation and struggles of working from home, admitted to increasing irritability. Generally an upbeat person, the separation from routine had taken a toll. Others described the psychological wear and tear about worrying for staff, colleagues, family, and friends. How, as one friend and senior university leader put it, do you continue to fight an invisible enemy when the death toll continues to mount? Seemingly contradictory, the question hinged on the realization that your best actions can be negated by your neighbor's worst actions. Case in point, My wife and I decided to place a Black Lives Matter sign on the edge of our property. Positioned alongside a major crosstown artery, the sign was visible to passersby in both directions. For 2.5 weeks, the sign sat comfortably on the roadside perch until it disappeared. Without notice or comment, someone removed our sign. They left the one saying climate voter, but not Black Lives Matter. The theft of our sign made me wonder about words, punctuation, and meaning. Although the sign bore no punctuation, clearly some read it as possessing a period. Black Lives Matter, period. While others saw a question mark. Black Lives Matter? And many an exclamation point. Black Lives Matter. A week went by and we decided to put up another version, which we guarded with other political signs. A few days after that, someone placed a Trump Pence sign next to the Black Lives Matter sign, which we removed. We couldn't tell if this was a feeble attempt at dialogue, a form of transgressive behavior, organized action, or something to worry about. Removing the sign, we thought, the more graceful thing to do. It is in these moments that we must all strive for some modicum of grace. The circumstance may spring from a celebratory occasion when, like a Jesse Norman, you get to honor someone for their fine achievements. It may come when called on to eulogize a friend, family member, or colleague whose days ahead have ended. Whether celebratory or eulogy, alone or in a crowd, you all have a role in building and sustaining a grace-filled community. It is why, in good times and bad, many of us find ourselves turning to that old standby, Amazing Grace. Written, we are told, in 1772 by the poet and clergyman John Newton. Newton was a man who proved he was willing to change. Before joining the church, he spent time at sea. Eventually, he made a living ferrying human cargo from the shores of Africa to the ports of the Americas. He eventually abandoned that world to join the Anglican Church. And in 1779, he published the words that have gained meaning and weight with each successive generation. So I leave you today with those words, born of a different era, challenged by a different code of ethics, framed by a world of cruel encounter and confrontation. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. See your way to building communities that are responsible, forward-looking, experimental, inclusive, where all learn and teach. In this world of conflict and contestation, in the aftermath of this contentious election season, become architects of a grace-filled community. Thank you. And now let's have a conversation.
Well, Earl, thank you for that. That was exactly, I think, what we hoped when we invited you. I should be allowing the applause to die down right now, but somehow or another, the audio on my computer isn't bringing it through as loudly as I'm sure that it deserves to be. We do have a bit of time for some questions, and I'm going to start with the one that's come in that puts you most on the spot, I suspect. We have a librarian colleague who'd like you to put your Emory hat back on for a moment. Now, you probably know how that goes. And answer this question. Is a university like Emory that doesn't have a university press, isn't it a free rider in this system? And if it is, what should be its responsibility to support the health and soundness of scholarly communications?
So yes, probably could have inferred from my from what I had to say that I suspect that places like Emory that at one point had a press and abandoned their press um, would amount to what Bill Bourne referred to as a free rider in a classic essay that he co-authored some years ago. I actually think and believe that one of three things should happen. That each provost at universities like Emory should be tasked with creating a fund that actually helps to offset and defray the cost for publishing. And so that's one way to think about doing it. You're doing that way in an individual case by case basis, and that may appeal to some. I mean, my preference is actually creating some form of a common market where we actually are pooling resources and the community as a whole is contributing to the common good. That will require a certain kind of not only economics, but policing. But it may be that in that way, we can ensure the survival of the university press system. And then by extension, the libraries that are in a symbiotic relationship with those university presses. I mean, the third piece is that some will say, no, why don't we just go it alone? And if we do that in a place like Emory, then we will have to begin to rethink the whole tenure model because I think the tenure model that has matured over the last 4 decades was not the same one that was in place in the mid to late 1960s. And so if tenure is going to endure, then we're going to have the question of what kind of scholarly production and what forms of scholarly communication warrant the creation of new knowledge that is peer reviewed and garners then some version of permanent employment. That would be my answer to that question. And I'm sure my colleagues at Emory love the fact that I'm still opining upon what they should do.
Well, fair enough. And you may know that your own university press at University of Michigan this week has published the first peer-reviewed rap album in the history of American university presses.
Yeah.
That's certainly pushing the envelope on our traditional monograph expectations.
No, and it goes back to even winning the Pulitzer Prize and what forms of artistic endeavor warrant the kind of creative accolades, and how do we actually peer review something like a rap album? I love the experimentation. I'm hoping that we will find our ways to engage in a little bit more.
Okay, let me turn to another question from one of our librarian colleagues in the audience who would like to hear more of your views about the process as you've experienced, however you've experienced it, of universities and academic institutions fostering examinations of reparations and other similar movements towards establishing justice over time. Her exact language is that's so far from what many institutions do, which is to issue a diversity, equity, inclusiveness framework and then keep on with the same practices they had before. But reparations.
Yeah, so reparations is something that is front and center for me right now. I'm teaching a course, I taught a course last semester in public policy on history, reparations and policy. I'm reteaching that course this semester. The center I'm directing is in the final stages of securing a grant on reparations to partner with 8 or so colleges and universities across the United States to begin community-based reparations examinations. And so what we aim to do there, and this may be a way to explain, is to work with these 8 or 10 institutions and where they would design a way to begin to actually write the histories of those communities with questions about reparations at the core, but do so in partnership with the community's members themselves. And so this would be in a kind of way, crowdsource in a particular way. And with the idea, the culminating product would actually be offered to the municipal governments and to think about then the policy implications. 2 examples actually stand out right now. One comes out of Evanston, Illinois, where the Evanston City Council He spent several years looking at his own history and came up with a set of recommendations a year ago for utilizing the resources from the decriminalization of marijuana and the taxes there to actually underwrite community development in Evanston. Some may have seen also Asheville, North Carolina's board, city council voted this summer 7-0 to not only have engaged in the history of Asheville, but to then be charged with coming up with a set of policy recommendations that speak to it. This is in parallel to what has been a bill before the in the U.S. House or proposed bill in the U.S. House since 1988. The late John Conyers introduced what became H.R. 40 in 1988, and now Congresswoman Shirley Jackson Lee has been the primary architect of that legislation. There are efforts nationwide, but what I call for in this talk and going back is that I worry that DEI alone indeed allows too many institutions to engage in the question of diversity by the numbers, where they're counting bodies without actually looking at what structures and systems and processes need to be shifted, what aspect of the culture needs to be addressed, and hence a shift to reparations is my attempt to force open a way to move beyond just a DEI framework. Whether it is possible and doable, only time will tell.
Interesting, yes. Here in Arizona, we voted yesterday on legalizing marijuana and we're overwhelmingly in favor of it, but I don't think we had particularly enlightened ideas about what to do with the money.
Yeah.
Here's a question of a form that I'm sure you've heard before. That's another one to point the needle a little bit. Are we at risk of draining the grace out of our colleges and universities by building larger and larger administrative staffs with more and more high-paid administrators that eat more and more of our scarce resources?
The answer is always yes. Let me see if I can find a neutral spot in that question, because
I said it had a needle pointed in it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was provost, I used to argue that sometimes we needed to introduce more efficiencies in the system to be able to create purposeful inefficiency. And so scholarship, in my view, did not, and new discoveries did not always fall into place between 8 and 5. You wanted to be able to make sure that a university was efficient enough to allow people to actually be highly inefficient where they needed to be inefficient. Sometimes that efficiency required then you add staff. So I'll give an example. So when I was provost, I remember engaged in an intense conversation with colleagues about the addition of staff for advising. And they were complaining that we were spending more money on advising. I said, fine. That means then the faculty will have to absorb that responsibility. But the answer is no, we don't want to do that either. I said, well, okay, so we got a little bit of a catch-22. You don't want to actually absorb the responsibility of advising, and I understand why. There are a whole lot of ways in which your time is being challenging and committed. But then you don't want us to hire someone. That leaves the students in the lurch. I mean, at some point we have to make a decision one way or the other. So we hired people to do it. But that looked like on one page that we were adding personnel. But in another way, it was offset because there was need there, no one to fill it. I understand the need to lower the overhead cost, and was one that we actually, when I was provost, my colleague and I, Mike Mandel, who was the chief financial officer, we took millions of dollars of unnecessary overhead out of the system intently and purposely so we could actually redirect it to the academic mission of the institution. And that included, we hired one person who all of a sudden now job was to make sure that instead of having 15 or 20 different contracts with vendors, we had 1 or 2 so we could maximize the economic scale and return. I mean, that actually netted us a huge margins that could be redeployed. It was those kinds of things that sometimes purposeful addition of administrators actually can improve, and that redounds to the benefit of the institution. Adding people just for the sake of adding people should be no one's goal.
Okay, I think we have one more that's a large one, and we're watching our clocks, so this may be our last question. Princeton's president said that his institution was still, after all these years, marked by systemic racism, and he got yelled at by the Department of Education in consequence. After all the work of the last 50 years, what do you think explains the persistence of such challenges, even in universities? Where's the best place to start to deal with them? If you had one place to start, where would you go?
Yeah, that's a fascinating and fabulous question. So part of it, what the president of Princeton, I think, was alluding to is that Princeton has a deep history that in and of itself was not altered just by making itself available to women first, and then Black and Brown and Asian students in greater numbers secondly. And remember that it was at Princeton where the former sons of plantation owners would bring their manservants, enslaved people, to campus and live with them. That history is still there and known in the Princeton context. And so there is this question about how institutions actually bring forward old practices and how we begin to undo them. And so one little thing, I'll use Princeton as an example, but I think is applicable to other schools, is I remember the first time I was on the Princeton campus, and I realized something about inside or outside of culture at Princeton as a visitor, because I had been invited to give a talk. This is circa 1992 at Princeton, and I was walking to a room, and I got on campus, and I realized, oh my goodness, I can't find a name on the building. I have no idea where I am. And there was this powerful sense that I was an outsider, and that I knew it by the ways in which we actually put signage on our building. I mean, something as subtle as that is a question about whether the community in and of itself is inviting you in, or the community is already saying only those who are in need to know and will know where to go. It is that piece when we look at something as basic as just the architecture of our campus that we can begin to actually redesign and reconfront our history of inclusion and exclusion. Very few campuses have, I think, useful wayfinders for folks who are just wandering on their campus and who are trying to understand and experience it. And so I said this to my friends at Princeton over the years, but you taught me something very, very valuable. And it took me 3 years or 4 years at Emory for us to actually finally start putting up signs so that when people came on campus, they had a little sense of where they were going and what the buildings were named, et cetera, et cetera. But to the questioner, I said, that's the place to begin. I mean, I think a little signage that allows the visitor not to be and feel excluded.
So I'll take that as a metaphor for helping people find out where they want to go and where is to their advantage to go, and how to get there. And that's the business we're in a lot of ways.
Exactly right. That should be the business we always keep front and center in the work that we do.
That's gorgeous. Okay. Well, Earl, thank you. I'd love to be around to continue this discussion in the aisles afterwards and take you to lunch, but we're going to have to forego that for today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Members of the audience, we're promising you now a 10-minute coffee break before you work your way through Pathable and find your way to the next session. Meanwhile, thank you to Earl, and thank you to Katina and Leah for their structure in getting this set up and for getting us off to such a good start. Thank you all for being here, and have a good day. Bye-bye.